Berzelius, which is our only infrastructure that is dedicated to AI research. So by collaborating with this program, we could get access to infrastructure, basically. And we were quite early, back in 21, 22. There was not a lot of other initiatives that have built open models. So we also collaborated with NVIDIA to use their software stack, because the infrastructure in Sweden is, of course, a DGX-based system. So we wanted to use the Nemo Megatron software stack to train our models. And when we started this, we really did not have any competence in HPC. So my team, they're good experts in language models and natural language understanding, but no one had scaled up training on multi-node systems before. So we sort of learned by doing this as we went along, and we got really good help from NVIDIA. And we also started to try to build a community around this on Discord called AI Nordics. It's still around, but not as active anymore. We found out that it's really, really difficult and challenging to keep a community going. And I mean, we're just researchers interested in doing other stuff. So I think that's a challenge, building a community. There should probably be dedicated people for that, and we don't have the resources for it. And then we have the National Supercomputer Center, which was a major player that they host the AI infrastructure here in Sweden. So, but one of the main challenges for us was the data, right? I mean, when we started this, our plan was to build a 100+ billion parameter model. So we knew that we would need to have at least the same order of data as GPT-3 was trained on, so like 300 billion tokens or something. And our first bet was to go to the National Library here in Sweden, because they have been storing text data since forever. They have everything. But of course, they were quite reluctant to collaborate. They don't want to give their data to just any researcher. Their work at that time, they were also quite skeptic about what generative models could be used for. There was a lot of paranoia and fear, and no one had really tried this in Europe at the time. So there was no sort of there was no precedence in Europe to sort of rely on. So in the end, we had to compile our own data set, and that's now called the Nordic Pile. It's based on the pile, of course, from Luther. So the English parts of the Nordic Pile comes from Luther. And then we simply just took whatever we found, right? Any open data sets that happened to lie around, we just included them. And in the end, surprisingly, we actually ended up with like 320 billion tokens, not only on Scandinavian languages, but also including some English and some code, but definitely enough to train a large model. So that was nice. We spent basically half a year collecting data and processing data. But of course, we could never release the data. We were, from the start, our plan was to produce everything as open source. But since we are at the sort of semi-private organization, we also have to fight the organizational structure. And we can talk more about this at the second part. But that was challenging. So we have not been able to release that data set. And it's now outdated, as I will show in a couple of slides. When it comes to the infrastructure, by collaborating with WASP, we could get access to the Berzelius system, which is still our only AI infrastructure in Sweden. We were able to use a third of the cluster since we were sort of the pilot project there. So that was 160H or A100s, so DGX nodes. And we actually got continuous allocation for around 6 months on that system. So we were able to both do the scaling sort of work and then also train all of our models in that time. So we ended up training up to 40 billion parameters. And when we did the evaluation of our scaling sort of runs, we did not think it was worth going above 40 billion parameters. And that's a data question, essentially. We did not have enough high quality data. But that was a nice setup. So already in 22 we had the first models, or we had all of our models, GPT-3. And then of course we tried to get them as openly released. And I think you've all seen this picture from Irene. I think she has actually talked at your seminar previously, right? So this is a compilation she did back in 23 with the open versus proprietary models. So proprietary are below the line and open models are up above the line. And you can see GPT-3 up there in a blue box. So back in 22, when we had produced the models, we could release them as sort of under a research license. And this was also due to the sort of organizational structure that we were working within and the collaborations we had with other actors. So people were a bit skeptic about generative models at the time. They were afraid of primarily state actors to the east of Sweden using these models to produce disinformation and propaganda. That, of course, never happened. But there was a lot of paranoia going around. So we could only release the models as for research purposes with a manual vetting process. So one person in my team had to sort of manually go through all the applications. That was a hassle. And we spent almost a year with internal negotiations before we could actually come to a completely open release of our models. And they are now openly released with a sort of Apache 2 license. But that was a year of internal negotiations, and we can come back to that also later on. It was a horrible experience. And I guess this is something you all know about, what happened during last year with the sort of the trend of open models. And these are numbers from, to the left there, Stella, which I guess some of you know from Luther. She maintains a list of all the sort of open models. I don't know how up to date it is right now, but the blue line are all the open models that she has compiled. And I mean, it's quite obvious that last year was really the trend of open models. And to the right, there is some data from Maxim that he published on Twitter, I think. And it sort of indicates that, well, this is the performance gap between proprietary and open models, right? And it sort of indicates that the gap might be closing a little bit, at least until the latest model from OpenAI. I would never claim that we are closing the gap, but I think, I mean, for all practical purposes, I think it's safe to say that open models have reached capacity where they are actually useful for actual applications. And I think that is true going forward also. For most practical applications that we see, llama-based models will probably suffice going forward. And I mean, we also do fine-tuning of the llama models to accommodate them for Swedish applications. Right, so we spent last year sort of trying to get the models released, and eventually we got there. And this year we have been trying to take the next step. So producing much more data and higher quality data, and also looking at multimodality. So adding just multimodal other modalities to our models. And we don't do anything fancy there. We just do autoregressive training across modalities. So essentially just tokenize everything into one blob of data and just training an autoregressive model on everything. And right now we're working on a demo for an audio to audio model with a sort of text to audio transform in the middle. And it seems to work. We don't really have enough resources to make that into sort of a foundation model for Swedish audio, but it's going to be a nice demo at least. But something we have been working on, which I want to mention, is this. This is our new data set called SWEB, the Scandinavian Web. And we have done that by taking all of Common Crawl, everything, and we came up with a new processing pipeline based on a new extraction tool that is a trained transformer. And we have extracted everything in North Germanic. And it's actually more than 1 trillion tokens, which is quite surprisingly much for such a small language family. And the good news is that this data set will be openly released. It's a surprise for all of us because our legal team has actually said yes to this. And we have just went with that, and we are, I think in the next couple of weeks, we are actually releasing this data set. And this is from the Hugging Face repo where it will be released. There's also paper detailing the processing pipeline and things like that. But this is a nice resource for Scandinavian and Nordic LLM work going forward. collaborating with other groups in Europe. So I was talking about the infrastructure. We only have one system in Sweden where we can actually do AI development, and that's sort of dedicated to academic research. So if we want to get access to the sort of large-scale systems in Europe, we need to apply for access from EuroHPC. And we want to do things on a larger scale now. So we are teaming up with other groups in Europe that share this idea. And I want to just mention one of these initiatives. We're part of many right now. But I want to talk a little bit more about Eurolingua, because that's an initiative where we try to really work on open models. And this is a collaboration between my group and the Fraunhofer AIAS group, which is the group who has been leading the Open GPT-X model work in Germany, which is their counterpart to GPT-3, basically. And they have been working on their models for quite some time, and they are now trying to get them openly released. They're having the same challenges as we had with the organization and the legal team there. But they will be released within the next couple of weeks, as I understand it. So we have been teaming up the two teams behind GPT-3 and OpenGPT-X, and we are now training a new series of open foundation models for the European languages then. And we call this Eurolingua GPT. We have received what's called an extreme scale allocation. So the way it works in Europe is that we can apply for access to the European AI infrastructure through EuroHPC. And if you're lucky enough and have a convincing application, you can get extreme scale allocations, which is what we got for this project. And I think we got the largest one provided so far, which is it's a substantial amount. We think we can train models up to, I don't know, 70 billion parameters or something like that. And the idea is to train first a series of models for the official European languages. So that's like 24 languages. And then we're going for much better coverage of also minority languages, up to like 46 different languages towards the spring. And all of this is going to be openly released, of course. That's sort of the starting point of this work. But I mean, we do have challenges here in Europe, and I just want to mention this. I'm not going to talk about the different aspects. I mean, these are the sort of components that we need to do this kind of work. Competence, I would say that's sort of a solved problem. We do have that. But we have our specific challenges here in Europe. And when it comes to funding, here in Europe, and especially in the Nordic region, people are really focused on providing funding for research. This is basically the only type of funding we have, unless you're sort of a startup or something. But from my perspective, this is not a research problem to be competitive when it comes to foundation models. The focus should be on providing artifacts and providing and doing whatever works, right? It's not about coming up with an alternative to backprop. This is not the question here. The question is just to scale up whatever we know works and actually have a focus on producing really, really good models. And we don't really have that kind of funding mechanisms. And this is, I think, when I talk to people in Europe, it's the same problem everywhere. And when we get these European large-scale projects, it's also about doing research. So this is a common challenge here. And then, of course, the major one, data. We're really, really good at regulating here in the European region. We have the strictest data protection laws in the world, and we need to be compliant with all of this when we train our models. And this is really, really unclear at the moment, exactly what this means. So, for example, in our case, when we have produced a SWEB data set, which we will release, it's based on Common Crawl. And around 90% of all the data on Common Crawl is copyrighted by authors, right? Can we use that or can't we use that? It's a gray zone. No one really knows, seems to know at the moment. And then we have really strict regulations around PII, so personally identifiable information. You have to remove it. And unless unless you do that, you can also be fined extensively if you don't. And then, of course, we have the infrastructural problems. We can apply for access to our beautiful supercomputers, but we need large-scale allocations, and we need continuous usage of our infrastructure. It's not optimal for us to sort of get an allocation where we can train for 24 hours and then we have to shut it down and wait for another 24 hours, which is sort of what happens now. We just want to do one large-scale run and train a model to completion and then evaluate and see if we need to sort of continue or reiterate, right? But we do produce models continuously, and we have convinced our organization finally that everything should be open source. There are sort of different versions of the licenses that we use here. Some are Apache 2, some are derivatives of whatever the base model was, like in the case of Llama, for example. But I'm quite satisfied with actually getting to a position where we can provide models, even if the licenses are sort of in flux at the moment. And as you can see on this slide, we don't only pre-train models from scratch, like in the case of GPT-3. We also do continued pre-training. So we take the Llama models or Mistral or whatever, and then we continue training on all of our Swedish data. Then we can enhance the capacity on the Scandinavian languages. And then we also produce encoder-based models for fine-tuning purposes and stuff like that. And by that, I think I'm going to stop sharing and maybe go for discussion.
Magnus, thank you so much. That was brilliant, especially toward that slide around the challenges facing institutions and efforts like yours. I think is something that has created a lot of buzz in the chat, and as we as a community here, and I can certainly echo your thoughts around the challenges and the effort required, but also the rich rewards of community building. Look for answers when it comes to answering questions around when we're speaking to philanthropy or to states around how to support this, efforts like yours. Just an update on timings. We're going to run with questions for the next sort of 13 or so minutes before cutting to the Chatham House rules portion, and then we will wrap up at 1:15. But Magnus, if you need to go before then, don't hesitate. So do stick your hand up if you have a question. I'll come to you. Just tell us who you are when you're asking a question, and I'll kick us off because the piece that I'm really interested in is some of the conversations that actually I've overheard you having with Josh and other builders around the world around the where the biggest opportunities for collaboration lie with other institutes doing things. And the reason I ask this question is, to a layman, scale seems to really matter. And to me, perhaps collaboration is a solution to scale. Now, is that nonsense? And if it's not nonsense, where does that, where can scale be found through collaboration, and what are the barriers to it? Then I'll come to Zach, then Alec. Thanks, Magnus.
Yeah, no, I mean, I agree. And that is also the reason why we are now driving Nordic and European initiatives. I don't really believe in only national initiatives anymore, at least not when it comes to foundation models. I mean, there is still a point in having national initiatives to fine-tune models and getting sort of the right data in place. But if we really want to build models from scratch, and there is sort of a point in doing that because of the European regulations. So we need to be compliant, we need to be transparent, we can have control over the data sources and stuff like that. But it's simply not doable on a sort of on national only level. Especially considering in our case, the North Germanic language family, it makes better sense to do that on a Nordic or Scandinavian level. So trying to collaborate with our friends in Denmark and Norway and Iceland. But it's challenging due to our data regulations, right? So even if people are really open for this, at least in the sort of model developer community, we talk all the time. I mean, we have these data regulations that makes it really difficult for us to share data and to get data access. And also when it comes to infrastructure, we don't really have sufficient infrastructure in the Nordic region yet. Well, there is Lumi up in Finland, but it's also AMD-based system, which has its own challenges. and maybe merits, but mostly challenges. So we are sort of we are completely reliant on European scale infrastructure, and that's also why it's beneficial to sort of coordinate between the different initiatives in Europe. And there are some of them going on right now. There's one in Spain, there's one in Germany, there's one in Finland, for example. And we all want to build these European level models. And yeah, collaboration, I would say, is the key for us who are sort of pressed by resources.
Thanks, Magnus. Zach.
Thanks, Magnus. This was great, and it's great to learn more about AI Sweden. I'm a partner and managing director at Prosperity of the Commons International, a commons-focused international development firm, and also I lead AI policy at a U.S. policy accelerator called the Future U.S. I have two questions for you. One is, what was the culture in the Swedish government or in Sweden at large when you were proposing, or whoever was proposing AI Sweden, such that it was received as a good idea? That seems like it's particularly useful for our public AI conversation about how we get more public AI to happen. And also, I'm very interested in, as public AI moves forward, that it avoids privatization as much as possible. So what is the legal structure of AI Sweden, and what do private partners get for their funding?
Yeah, I can't really speak to the sort of the feeling in the government structure when this was formed. I was at another organization then, but my impression is that this has been quite so people have been quite positive to this idea, especially sort of in the innovation landscape. And we do have quite a good support from the government and from ministers of digitalization and things like that, and they are really helping out. At the same time, we do have budget cuts when it comes to innovation projects in Sweden, which is not beneficial for us. So I think it's a mixed bag, and it's also, I mean, Sweden is a fairly small country. There's a lot of actors who want to sort of have a piece of the AI cake, and there is going to be competition in that kind of landscape. We try to find our place by being in between academia and industry, and to sort of provide a safe place for organizations to share knowledge and to sort of do things that no one else is really taking on. So in the case of large language models, no one else was sort of trying that at the time. So it becomes sort of natural for us to do that then. And so organizations join this because they see some benefit in collaborating, right? And what they get from the partnership fee is this sort of collaborative environment. And they also have the potential to influence projects. They have the potential to influence setup of, for example, hardware. We do have a lot of hardware providers, and we test their systems. We train models on their systems, and we provide sort of performance figures and potentially, results from that. Some cases it works well, in some cases it doesn't. But yeah, I would say, I mean, most of our partners see the benefit. There are some that drop out after a time because they don't see the benefit. And I mean, that's how it's going to go, right? Me personally, I am not convinced of the benefit of the partnership structure, because I run a different type of organization in the lab organization, right? We don't really want to work for a partnership group. We want to work for all of Sweden. So I guess you have that tension, right? Not convinced, but I think it works out for us.
Thank you.
Alec, over to you.
Hi, Magnus. My name's Alec. I'm co-director at Open Future. We're a European think tank for the digital commons. I'm based in Warsaw, Poland, so I can only hope that one day you'll expand and create a Baltic AI project, which will allow us to benefit from all these developments that you've been doing. But I have a question about the copyright issues that you mentioned. I must say that when you mentioned there are data regulatory challenges in Europe, I was nodding my head, but when you first, I thought it would be about privacy regulation. And I must admit, I'm a bit surprised, though I trust you on this take that it's unclear I have been working a lot on copyright advocacy. I've been following the development of the text and data mining file. So I was just wondering, are there any efforts being done to clarify the law? Because on paper, I think it creates quite strong foundations, especially for research-based work, and that was sort of its goal. I know now there are voices that say this should be revisited, but until that happens, my reading would be that you should actually feel quite secure. So I'm curious to learn a bit more if you can share.
Yeah, it's really unclear. I mean, our impression when we started this was also that we were fine, that we had sort of the right of use as a research organization. But it turns out you might have a right of use in different regions in Europe, but especially here in Scandinavia, our copyright protection laws are very strict. And that goes then for Sweden and Denmark. And at the moment, I think the Danes have an even worse climate than us. They have a number of lawsuits going on. People are trying to sue OpenAI, for example, from Denmark for using copyrighted material. We have had visits from the sort of copyright owners organizations here in Sweden, and they have, of course, realized that we have trained on the pile, which included at that time books 3, which was not a great thing for us. So you have this whole discussion. And here in Sweden, I think that there is a lack of consensus right now what is really the position of this. Even if we would claim that we are only doing research, it would be unclear. And we are not only doing research. We want to produce actual artifacts that could be used commercially for anyone, right? And that makes it even more difficult. Yeah, so I mean, it is unclear, and I think the situation in the sort of Scandinavian region is worse than probably in Poland or something. Maybe we should come to you and train models.
Okay, thank you. That's very useful and interesting.
Lacey, bring us home, and then Nick, I'll just pause our recording before we come to you.
Oh, now I feel the pressure is on for a good question to bring us home with. Thank you so much, Magnus, for coming and chatting with us today. I'm Lacey Strom. I just was on the working in Capitol Hill on privacy legislation, and unfortunately live in a country where we still have not been able to figure that out. And so my question, and now I'm at a open source nonprofit leading their policy team that uses privacy enhancing technologies to help open up access to data. So have interesting questions along that thread for maybe another time. But the core question I wanted to ask you is along that kind of the GDPR limitations that you were, I guess, hinting at. And I think coming from the US context, and especially in privacy conversations on the Hill, a lot of times it's, well, we want to let innovators innovate. So we don't want to give them restrictions. And, like, look what Europe did and look at all the, mess that's opening over there. And so it's, on one hand, it's disheartening to hear sometimes that, like, some of that criticism might be true. But the hope that I would have is that, like, if you give researchers and intellectuals like guardrails, then they can figure out how to innovate within that. And so I guess my question is, like, given the regulatory environment in Europe, do you think that's possible? Or is some of the criticism where some of the privacy legislation like GDPR is a bit too rigid, and therefore some of the AI innovation is lacking behind because, for lack of a better way of saying it, like in the US, you can just break norms and laws that, like, in other places you can't do?
Well, I would say a bit of both, right? I mean, so some of the research projects that we are involved with at the European level try to tackle these questions. In particular, a project called Trust LLM, which is sort of geared for building trustworthy, reliable solutions within the European context. And that's really an incentive to have that project, right? To do research on what does it mean to be compliant? How can we sort of tackle these problems? And there's a lot of research going on in that sort of space. But at the same time, of course, I mean, it is true that regulation stifles innovation, especially if you do it like the European Commission has done it, right? Because we can't train foundation models in Europe. We can't provide these kind of resources for other people to build upon. And we are completely at the mercy of the hyperscalers or the Chinese developers at the moment. And neither of them are good solutions for us. So I'm sort of trying to be mildly positive to the idea of having regulations as a sort of way to counter the sort of monoculture or cultural imperialism that is happening right now. But it's really not working out for us. There needs to be an alternative that allows us to actually train foundation models in Europe.
It's a really strong note, I think, to end us on there. So thank you again, Magnus, for joining us. And I think we can make sure that it reaches the recording that we'll take just a minute to unmute and give Magnus a round of applause in 3, 2, 1.
Thank you, guys. And I fortunately I have to leave. I gotta manage kids and dogs. So nice to be here and nice to see you and